You ever notice how some action scenes have you on the edge of your seat, while others barely elicit any response at all? I thought about that while watching Extraction, which, in addition to big star Chris Hemsworth doing what he does best,
You just passed it!
For fuck's sake!
has lots and lots of the most impressive sequence of which includes what appears to be a 12-minute single take, which I gotta say was pretty awesome. As to what made it so good, at first glance the answer seems obvious. I mean, come on, it's got stunts, explosions, gunfights, knife fights, car chases, you name it. It throws everything at you but the kitchen sink, then it sets the sink on fire and throws that at you too. And while everything that happens comes across as completely chaotic, you know that behind the scenes, the planning and preparation and choreography that went into this one sequence must have been massive. It's hard not to be impressed. And yet, I don't think any of those reasons really gets to the heart of why the sequence worked so well.
Dude, it was kinda cool. Nah, it sucked. Yeah, but that one scene, dude, saw it sucked. It's like, people are so jaded. Like, if you showed that movie 50 years ago, people would be like, their brains would explode. It would be chaos. If you showed Transformers in like 1950, people now are like, yep, boo.
That's comedian Nick Swardson, and he makes an interesting point. The stuff that Hollywood can do these days is incredible. It borders on magic. He's also right to say that if an audience from 100 years ago saw a current action movie, their faces would probably melt off. And lastly, he's right to point out how strange it is that someone today can see something so incredible but be so unimpressed by it. However, as apt as Swardson's observation is, I have to disagree with his implication that that reaction is somehow inappropriate. Why? Because it happens to me all the time, and I'm willing to bet it happens to you as well. You're watching some exciting action scene filled with incredible stunts and mind-bending CGI, yet you feel completely... So why does that happen? More specifically, why does it happen with some scenes and not others? Were the lesser scenes poorly directed? Were the stunts too easy? Was the CGI not up to snuff? I'm sure there are times where all those things went wrong, like this hilariously awful rendering from The Mummy Returns. And yet, if you feel bored while watching an action sequence, I'm willing to bet the problem isn't visual, at least not in a technical sense. Consider all the visual excitement going on during this sequence from Extraction. After watching this, I wanted to see what it looked like on the page, so I checked out the screenplay by Joe Russo, and he did not disappoint. At no point during it did he just phone it in and say, they fight. Instead, he takes you step by step through everything that happens to the point that reading the screenplay makes you feel like you're watching the movie. You could even think of Russo as co-director. He's actually the one who points out where the scene should turn to a single take. Yet while the detail Russo goes into here is impressive, he goes into just as much detail during these later scenes, which for some reason were nowhere near as exciting. So, what really makes for effective action? And can that be boiled down to a usable formula? The best answer I've come across to that question comes from novelist Philip Pullman, author of the His Dark Materials trilogy and the soon-to-be completed Book of Dust trilogy. As if publishing two of the greatest fantasy series ever wasn't enough, Pullman also put out a collection of essays and lectures on writing he's given over the course of his career called Demon Voices that I highly recommend. One of my favorite anecdotes from the book is when Pullman says the protagonist's task must be hard to do, it must be easy to understand, and a great deal must hang on the outcome. Now, Pullman is talking about what makes a good story in general here, not what makes a good movie action sequence, but his criteria works so well for doing just that. Watch what happens when I apply his criteria to this sequence from Extraction. For instance, is the protagonist's task difficult to do? Well, let's see. Our protagonist, Tyler Rake, and his team of mercenaries have been hired to rescue Ovi, the innocent child of a not-so-innocent drug lord who's been taken hostage by an even less innocent rival drug lord and is being held under heavily armed guard in a crowded city patrolled by armed police and even more armed goons on the payroll of said drug lord. So yeah, I think extracting Ovi from these circumstances qualifies as a difficult task, and that was before everything went wrong and the job of rescuing Ovi fell almost entirely to Tyler. Up next, is this easy to understand? Well, it does seem pretty clear that Ovi is being held against his will. It's also pretty clear that Tyler is trying to rescue him. Doing so clearly becomes more difficult when this boat ride to safety is removed as an option, and it's pretty clear that all these people with guns trying to capture or kill Tyler and Ovi are obstacles in their way. So yeah, I'd say this is pretty easy to follow. I bet you could actually skip right to this point without watching anything else in the movie and still follow everything that's happening without too much trouble. Lastly, is there a lot riding on the outcome? Well, it'd be hard not to notice that our main characters' lives are at stake since we're reminded of that just about constantly. Every time we see someone get shot, stabbed, blown up, hit by a car, or just plain old beaten to death, we're reminded of the very real danger these two are in. Seeing all this death and destruction happen with such regularity shows us how easily it could happen to our two main characters. And it's not just that Tyler or Ovi could get killed that we're afraid of. Thanks to a clever bit of foreshadowing in the beginning, we know Amir, the drug lord responsible for kidnapping Ovi, is about as awful a human being as you'll find. Not only are we told he's the biggest drug lord in Bengal, more importantly, we're shown this brutally effective scene in which he orders this poor kid to cut off his own finger, something he's spared from doing only by dumb luck. Since we're shown what a bad guy Amir is early on, it heightens the tension we later feel for Ovi and Tyler. If they get captured rather than killed during this sequence, they won't be much better off. Since this sequence passed Pullman's criteria before filming even began, that means the incredible job that director Sam Hargrave and his crew did can really pay off. It's not that this other stuff doesn't matter, of course it does, it's just that it wouldn't have mattered anywhere near as much if the underlying story being told wasn't inherently compelling. Now, if you're feeling a bit skeptical, I don't blame you. Pullman's criteria seems to explain why this one sequence works, but does that mean it'll explain why any good sequence works? Will it also explain why any bad sequence fails? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's check out a few more action scenes, starting with this one from John Carter, where our hero sees his future love interest dangling perilously from an airship. Despite the dazzling visuals going on, this scene is pretty dull, and yet it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. So let's see what happens when we apply Pullman's criteria. Is this easy to understand? Yeah, the hero is trying to rescue the princess. Simple as that. Is there a lot riding on the outcome? Again, yeah, if he fails, then she'll die. Is this difficult to do? No, John Carter's defining feature is that he can jump really high, which we the audience already knew. This is neither difficult for him nor surprising for us. John's unfair advantage over everyone else in the movie is in stark contrast to Tyler and Ovi, who are at a huge disadvantage during this sequence. If we knew ahead of time that Tyler could just grab Ovi and magically jump to safety with him, the scene would not be very exciting. Moving on, you know I can't pass up an opportunity to talk about my favorite scene from Prometheus, so let's see if it passes our test. Is this easy to understand? I think so. Is it difficult to do? Well, judging by the laundry list of things Ellie has to do in order to survive, I'd say it is. And lastly, is there a lot riding on the outcome? Of course there is. However, within the same movie, we have this infamously stupid scene in which Milburn decides to play with an alien snake, which fails not one, not two, but all three of our components. Nobody's forcing him to do this, it makes no sense that he's doing it, and unlike Ellie, Milburn and Fifield are peripheral characters who aren't vital to the plot. As for the sequel to Prometheus, the considerably worse Alien Covenant, the story is easy to understand, and it does have a lot riding on the outcome, but it's only difficult to do because the characters are some of the dumbest people you'll ever meet. My final example comes from The Dark Knight Rises, which, similar to Prometheus, is a mixed bag of a movie. This penultimate clash between Batman and Bane, for instance, is among the best scenes of its kind. How do you not admire a villain who can fight and monologue at the same time?
Peace has cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you.
Unlike many superhero movies where the fight scenes are kinda cartoonish and silly, this one is dark and brutal. It beats both Batman and our criteria to a bloody pulp. However, as soon as this great scene ends, Bane proceeds to go full Dr. Evil, and instead of just killing Bruce, he puts him in a gigantic hole in the ground in the middle of God knows where, and then leaves him unattended.
I'm going to leave them alone and not actually witness them dying. I'm just going to assume it all went to plan. What?
Bruce goes from the near impossible task of defeating Bane in a fist fight to the very doable task of climbing out of a hole. A challenge that makes no sense, doesn't look that difficult, and doesn't have much at stake since he's attached to a rope. I highly doubt that if Amir broke Tyler's back, he'd then put him
Easily escapable situation involving an overly elaborate and exotic death.
And before you tell me that Bruce forgoes the rope in the end, and that's what finally allows him to succeed, and that this whole sequence is really one big metaphor for how you need to leave your comfort zone behind in order to self-actualize, it still doesn't make this compelling from a narrative standpoint because now it's just too predictable. Did you really think Bruce was going to die before the final act even takes place? The interesting thing about this scene, however, is that once Bruce forgoes the rope, and once you get over how pointless it is that he's here at all, this technically passes our test, which means Pullman's criteria is not perfect, which I probably should have told you, it had no chance of ever being. Formulas that never fail under any circumstances belong in the realm of math and science, not storytelling. There are no formulas that always work here. Returning to Extraction, this scene where a wounded Tyler gets into a big fight with his military buddy Gasper meets our criteria as well, but unlike Bane, whose presence looms over the Dark Knight Rises from the beginning, Gasper has nothing to do with Extraction until he shows up out of nowhere halfway through the movie. Since we don't know what makes him a formidable opponent ahead of time, this scene lacks the overwhelming sense of dread and impending doom that permeates this scene with Bane. And since we don't know Gasper all that well, his betrayal is a lot more surprising to Tyler than it is to us. As for the film's big finale, where Tyler has to get Ovi to the other side of a bridge for some reason, this passes Pullman's criteria as well, albeit barely. But whereas this earlier sequence took us by surprise and felt wildly inventive, this one feels a lot more predictable and obligatory. While watching it, it seemed unlikely to me that Ovi was going to get killed, but it seemed equally unlikely that both Ovi and Tyler were going to survive, which made something like this all but inevitable. So what does all that mean for our action formula? Should we simply discard it? I would say no. Pullman's criteria is useful so long as you recognize its limitations. It likely will be able to help you tell a good story or figure out what's wrong with a bad one so long as you understand that the formula isn't going to do the work for you. You're still going to have to think for yourself.
Get in, kid. Come on. Come on.